Hey everyone, my name is Lynx, and welcome to the Optimal Guide to Healing Dungeons. In this guide, I'll be focusing on high-level healing in endgame dungeons and how to optimize your damage and keep everyone alive while doing maximum DPS in those dungeons. This guide will expect you to know your class already and assume you are max level, but there is information in this guide that can trickle down to the lower level dungeons. Without any further ado, let's get into it. Before I even start saying anything, I just need to tell you that Benefic, Cure 1, and Physick are dead spells. In dungeons, you should be using Benefic 2, Cure 2, and Adloquium. Mana in dungeons is not a big deal, so you should be using your heavier spells so that you can keep people alive with less GCDs. The first thing you want to do when you enter a dungeon is analyze your party's gear and pick up on subtle cues that can tell you how your players are going to operate inside that dungeon. Some cues to look out for are your tank popping sprint, which usually means they want to go fast through the dungeon, or if the tank isn't using cooldowns, then they'll need extra healing, or maybe if there's single targeting on AOE, then you might need to do some more damage. You should be dotting enemies as you're moving between mob packs and understanding how long your dot will last. Holy only beats a full duration Dia on 6 targets, Gravity only beats a full duration Combust 3 on 5 targets, and Artivore only beats a full duration Biolysis on 4. If your tank isn't pulling enough and you think you can handle more, then you can encourage bigger pulls by moving ahead of your tank and showing interest in pulling more, or just typing in chat. Remember that as a healer, you do have the power to pull more, and if you know that you can keep your tank alive, then you might want to do it even if they're not ready for it. Pushing people out of their comfort zone is somewhat frowned upon in the community, but in my opinion, it's not a big deal. If you can keep people alive, then what's the problem? The next thing you need to know is that damage is a form of mitigation and you should be focusing on DPS. Specifically for White Mage, Holy is great because it can stun enemies, and that stun means that they're not doing any damage at all, which means you don't need to do any healing at all. So you should be focusing on killing things as soon as possible so you can get out of combat as soon as possible, and that way your long duration cooldowns can keep people alive through the packs and you won't need to worry about using GCD heals. Remember that Holy is only a DPS increase over Glare on 3 targets, and Gravity and Art of War are on 2 targets. The next thing is to understand that using AOE healing for single target is okay. If your tank is taking a lot of damage and your only cooldowns left are AOE healing, then it's worth using them to keep your tank alive. In dungeons, it's not too worth it to hold your cooldowns for very long. You should be popping them as soon as possible. Specifically for Benediction, people love to hold Benediction for savior moments, but in reality, just let your tank get low and then use Benediction when he's low. It's fine. You'll have more cooldowns as you go through the packs. You need to understand how your tank's cooldowns work and how they mitigate/heal to be an effective healer. Specifically when playing with a warrior, when you see the Nascent Flash buff on that warrior, you know they're going to be using a ton of healing. So that means when you see Nascent Flash, if they get a little bit low, you don't need to immediately heal them, as you will be assuming that they'll be healing themselves with that Nascent Flash. Similarly with Dark Knights using TBN, you know that they don't need healing, and everything else. Just pay attention to your tank's cooldowns, and if you don't know how the tank cooldowns work, I suggest playing a tank class for a bit, or at least looking up the job guides on the Final Fantasy XIV website. Understand your tank's cooldowns, understand what they're using, understand how often they're using it, and that will lead to being a better healer. This leads into having trust in your teammates and only healing when you know that they will die. Obviously, if someone keeps getting hit by AoEs, then you shouldn't trust them, but most of the time you should be trusting your teammates to dodge AoEs and avoid avoidable damage. This can help you with healing the bare minimum, as there are times where there can be a mechanic that will one-shot a player if they have low HP, but you know that they're good enough to dodge it, so you don't heal them immediately. I do this very often in dungeons. I leave people low knowing that they will dodge mechanics, and that way I can keep my DPS uptime. Now you shouldn't be doing this if you don't trust the player, but build up trust throughout a dungeon and see how your players are dodging AoEs. Keeping your eyes out as a healer is very important, and you should be watching your players at all times. Next up is limiting your movement and only moving when absolutely necessary. This is something casters love to do when they're new at the game and they move around and dodge as much as possible, but in reality you can sit still for most of every single encounter. Limiting your movement is very important since most of your skills have a cast time, and if you're constantly interrupting that cast time, then you're actually doing nothing. Try to move as little as possible and try to focus on sitting in one spot. It might be hard if you have ADHD, but sitting still and casting without moving is the fastest way to get more DPS. On top of that, don't clip your GCD if possible. Especially with Benison and those low cooldown skills, you want to try to tie these up with your instant cast spells. So reapply Benisons or Essential Dignities when you're using your dot, or just try to use your off-global cooldowns when you already have an instant cast ready. Clipping your GCD to off-global heal is worth it sometimes, but in most scenarios you want to try to limit that as much as possible. Don't do this to a fault and don't kill people for it, but it should be something on your mind. You should also only be Esuna-ing targets with debuffs that are actually debilitating. What I mean by this is paralysis, vulnerabilities, things like that actually cause more damage should be Esuna'd, but if they have a dot that's not too powerful, such as in the New Heroes Gauntlet dungeon, there is an Electro debuff, then you don't need to Esuna that. You can heal through it, it doesn't really cause too much damage, and if you use a GCD on Esuna, that's a GCD lost to damage. Having a mouse over rescue macro handy is also very important as a healer. There are many times where I'll use a mouse over rescue if someone's in a wrong position or is about to get hit by a mechanic, and you can clutch save them without even having to think about it. Just put your mouse over them, hit the button, boom, you rescued them. With those general tips out of the way, let's move into some of the specifics for each class. Starting with White Mage. A common misconception with White Mage is wanting to get as many Afflatus Miseries out as possible, when Afflatus Misery is actually a DPS loss on single target. Now on AoE pulls, yes, it is worth it to use Lilies to get Afflatus Misery, as you'll be doing crazy AoE damage, but on single target, if nobody's taking deadly damage, then you should just sit on all 3 Lilies and not worry about it. The reason why Afflatus Misery is a DPS loss, even though it has the same potency as 3 Glares, is that it takes 4 GCDs to use. As opposed to 3 Glares using 3 GCDs for 900 potency, Afflatus Misery takes 3 Lilies, which is 3 GCDs already, and then the GCD it takes to cast a spell, and that means you're losing 1 GCD of 300 potency. So don't worry about overcapping your Lilies and only use them when you absolutely need them. It's okay to just spam Glares and not use your Lilies. With the size, it's worth using it in between your GCDs and clipping your GCD to get it off cooldown, but assuming you won't lose a usage or there's healing coming up that you need to do very soon, and you have a size ready for an AoE, you can save it a bit and use it in between your instant cast windows and not clip your GCD, and that way you'll get an efficient usage out of it. The way you want to think about all of your cooldowns really is that you shouldn't be losing usages throughout a fight. Especially on things like Benediction, you want to use these as often as possible because of just how powerful they are. Using Benediction often can keep you doing more holies, and that's very important to doing dungeons quickly. Now with healers, this mentality does get a bit skewed because holding on to heals for longer than normal, it can be worth it as you don't need to heal all the time, but in general, try not to lose usages of your efficient healing spells. If you have to use a GCD heal, look back at where you used an off global and maybe you can replan it or put it somewhere else so that you don't need to use that GCD heal. I promise you that almost every dungeon can be done with 0 GCD heals. You can basically use your damage spells throughout the entire dungeon if you're playing with decent players. With Presence of Mind, it will give you an extra cast of an entire spell throughout its duration, but only if you don't clip your GCD throughout it. It is worth to hold it a little bit if you have to clip your GCD soon. Make sure that you can get every single cast off inside Presence of Mind to maximize that speed increase on your casts. Temperance is a really good skill to use on trash packs, as flat mitigation reduction is great against tons of auto attacks. Remember that in dungeons, trash packs often hit harder than the actual bosses, and that means you want to be using most of your mitigation and healing spells and cooldowns on the trash packs. The bosses themselves aren't too bad. Asylum is a tricky one because most people hate standing in Asylum, so what I like to do with Asylum is place it in between 2 people, and that way even if you're not getting all players inside of it, you're still efficiently healing the people that need it. If your party is super spread out, then just use it on the tank for single target healing, but if players are spread out a bit but you can still get them in the Asylum, then try to position it in a way that they'll be able to move into it if they're close to it. The way I like to use Plenary is I just use it whenever I need to do AoE healing. Plenary is a great skill and can often reduce the amount of healing GCDs you need to use, so use it whenever AoE healing is needed, and then it'll come back up when you need it again later, or if it's not up, then that's okay. Regen is one skill that people love to use, but is often inefficient in the grand scheme of things. Now yes, Regen is a very efficient heal, but like all of your other GCD heals, you want to limit the amount of GCD heals you use. Spamming your Lilies, using Tetragrammaton, using Benediction, and these types of spells are way more efficient than using Regen. A good place to use a Regen, however, is in between mob packs, if in between mob packs you've already dotted all the enemies. Let's say you pull 3 enemies and then you're moving on to the next pack and all 3 enemies are already dotted, then you can put up a Regen on the tank, that's fine. Moving on to Astrologian, I find this is the hardest healer to optimize inside of dungeons because it really relies on player skill. The first thing I want to say is don't forget about Sinistry. This is something that I think many people forget exists, and even I underutilize most of the time. Sinistry is a great skill because even if you only intend to heal one target, you can put Sinistry on them and then use a Benefic too, and that will give them 40% extra healing. Now, using a star for DPS is very powerful, but however, it's often better to use it for healing. There are times when I'll hold on to a star cooldown and use it later if I know I need that AoE healing, because using star for AoE healing reduces the amount of GCDs you need to use. Similarly to Benison on White Mage, Celestial Intersection should be used when you have an instant cast available, or in between your Malefics. Try not to clip your GCD, as Astro is very easy to not clip your GCD. If you have to do multiple back-to-back double weaves, such as doing a draw or a play or a redraw, then you should be using your Lightspeed there. With the change in 5.3 removing the MP reduction on Lightspeed, this cooldown is now saved and used for utility. You shouldn't be using Lightspeed on cooldown, but instead when you need to use double weaves. Another great place to use Lightspeed is during heavy movement. Essential Dignity is a skill that I like to hold on to for a very long time. The fact that it does more healing the lower the health the target is means you want to get them as low as possible before using it. Essential Dignity has the potential to be insane healing if the target is very low HP. So I often let my tanks get very low, maybe scare them a bit, and then use ED and bump them back up to full HP. It's very important on Astrologian to use draw and sleeve draw off cooldown and try to get as many cards out into the fight, but be aware of burst timings. A skill cap in Astrologian is using your cards during burst windows, whether it be 60 seconds, 90 seconds, or 120 seconds. Since your divination is on a 2-minute cooldown, that often means you can get off 2 cards inside of your divination window. You can get 1 draw off, wait 30 seconds, and then you'll have another draw available, and that means when your divination is at 90 seconds, you should be holding on to a card, that way you can put out 2 cards during your divination window. Neutral Sect is a great spell, but often gets underutilized in dungeons because you don't want to GCD heal. Similarly for Horoscope, you're not going to be GCD healing very heavily inside of dungeons, so this skill definitely can get a pass. They're not bad spells per se, but in dungeons specifically, they're not amazing. Horoscope I often use as the 10-second version where I don't pop it and I just let it use its own little baby healing, so use it as you need to. The bubble on Astrologian in the form of Collective Unconscious is great for AoE damage, but also great for single target tank damage. Once again, since it reduces damage similar to Temperance, that means your tank will be taking flat less damage, and that's always great so that you don't have to heal them as much. Use this skill as often as possible. I find it's best to use it on trash packs and for AoE damage, but use it whenever you need to, and I find that this skill often goes underutilized. Celestial Opposition is one of those skills that I think is great on single target healing and is often underutilized for single target healing. Especially on a trash pack when you don't have many cooldowns available as Astrologian, using Celestial Opposition early into the fight so your tank's HP goes down slower is great. And finally on to Scholar. Not as difficult as Astrologian in my opinion, but there is a bit of a skill cap here, and that's in the form of your gauge. Using your Aether Flow stacks for healing or damage is a conundrum that has faced Scholars forever. In most scenarios, I prefer using my Aether Flow for healing on trash packs and damage on bosses. On trash packs, your tank will be taking massive damage, and that means it's often good to use X-Cogs and Lustrates on your tank to keep them alive, that way you can keep using Art of War. Don't forget about Dissipation either. I find that Dissipation is a great skill to use when your tank is taking a lot of damage. That way you can get out efficient Aether Flow usages and get the healing buff increase. Chain Stratagem is a single target crit buff, and I often get asked if it's worth using on AoE packs or holding for bosses. Now the way I like to use Chain Stratagem is putting it on the priority target, not to single target them down, but just to help out with the damage increase that it gives. Most trash packs you'll pull have one big target that has more HP than the others, or a priority target that wants to die first, such as a White Mage or a Caster, and using Chain Stratagem on that target can be great so that they die quicker in comparison to the other targets. Seraph is a great skill to use for single target, and it's often underutilized. It's basically a free cooldown with no cost, so using Seraph to get out that little shield is great for AoE healing and tank healing. I use Seraph basically on cooldown. I find it's one of the best skills on Scholar's Toolkit. Recitation is often used for Indoms or X-Cogs if people get really low. A Recite X-Cog can be great on your tank during a trash pack if you don't have much gauge available, but it often goes underutilized if you have your Scholar Tether available. Aether Pact is a great skill for tank healing. I use this on AoE packs when the tank is taking a lot of damage but I don't have many Aether Flows to use on him. Like I said, I like to use Lustrate on the tank and X-Cogs as well, but when I don't have those available, Aether Pact can be great to slow down your tank's death. Aether Pact alone probably won't keep your tank alive, but if you kill things fast enough, then it can keep them alive long enough that the mobs will die before they die. Once again, offense is a great defense. Emergency Tactics can be good if you need burst healing, but I often find it's not even worth using at all. Similarly with Fey Blessing is it's okay, but often goes underutilized just because of how often you have your Indoms available. Scholar also has Whispering Dawn, and that basically makes them the king of AoE healing. You have so many AoE healing options in the form of Whispering Dawn, Indom, Seraph, Fey Blessing, it's just crazy. This is what I'm talking about when I say using AoE healing for single target, as I often use these AoE skills on single target to keep the tank alive. Now, not all of them, obviously, I'm not saying you should use Indom on single target, but Whispering Dawn, Seraph, Fey Blessing, they're not bad to use single target to keep your tank alive. Fey Illumination is a pretty simple skill to use. You either want to use it as a healing potency increase since it gives 10% healing up, or a magic damage decrease for incoming damage. That's basically all the healing tips that I have. I hope you guys learned something today. That's all I've got for you today, friends. If you liked this video, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with my content, and check out my Patreon if you want to support me further. Follow me on Twitch for live streams, Twitter for tweets, and join my Discord to engage with me directly. All links are down in the description. Thanks so much for watching. Peace.